It was just another ordinary day at Eastbrook High, a school tucked away in the heart of suburban California, where students either found their place in the world or simply existed in the background, trying not to be noticed. Sophia Hunter, a 17-year-old senior with a passion for history, had always been the quiet type, the one who noticed the things others didn't. That day, however, something in her snapped. The class was buzzing, as it often did, when Ms. Emily Lawson, a teacher whose sharp opinions and equally sharp tongue had made her infamous among students, stood in front of the classroom, delivering her lecture on the post-civil rights era. The words she spoke seemed to brush past the truth. With confidence, she stated that by the 1970s, equality had been fully achieved in America. She spoke with authority, the kind that didn't leave room for questioning. Sophia's heart raced, her hand instinctively shooting up. The feeling in her chest was familiar, an unease that had lingered since her freshman year, a quiet understanding that some things were being left out, or worse, twisted. She couldn't stay silent this time. "That's not true," she said, her voice firm, louder than she intended. The educational system was still racially segregated. The war on drugs only worsened inequalities. A hush fell over the room, the air thick with the tension that followed. Sophia could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, some wide with surprise, others narrowing in judgment. Her words had landed with an unsettling force. Ms. Lawson's face tightened, and the smile she gave Sophia felt forced, like it was hiding something darker. "Alyssa," Ms. Lawson cut in, using the name of the student who had spoken up, her voice cold as she addressed the entire class. "Let's not start debating facts." But those were facts, and the truth had a way of demanding to be heard, even when others weren't ready to listen. Sophia's heart sank as Ms. Lawson's words cut through the air like a blade. "Enough, Sophia. Go to the office." The entire classroom held its breath. The chair beneath Sophia scraped harshly against the floor as she stood up, her legs shaking, not with fear, but with frustration. This wasn't just a simple disagreement. This was something deeper, something they weren't willing to see. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't disrupted anyone. All she did was speak the truth. Her mind raced as she walked out of the classroom, the quiet hum of whispers trailing behind her. Every step felt heavier, the hallway stretching before her like an endless tunnel. She wasn't sure what was worse, the shock of being silenced so suddenly, or the realization that she was the one being punished for speaking out. The principal's office was colder than she imagined, the walls stark and imposing. The secretary, barely lifting her eyes from her desk, motioned toward a row of plastic chairs. Sophia sat, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her breath shaky. The clock on the wall seemed to mock her with every second that ticked by. 15 minutes. 30. The weight of the entire situation pressed down on her chest, like a pressure she couldn't escape. When Principal David Richards finally emerged, his gaze was distant, almost indifferent. "Come in," he said with a hint of disinterest. But as she stepped inside and saw Ms. Lawson already seated, her stomach churned with dread. She knew this wasn't going to be fair. "She's been nothing but disruptive," Ms. Lawson began, her voice steady, as though it had been rehearsed, constantly challenging authority, making it difficult for the class to continue. Sophia's words caught in her throat. She hadn't been challenging anyone. She had just asked a question. But no one was listening. Not really. When Sophia stepped into the office, she expected some level of formality, maybe a stern talking to, or even a suspension. But nothing could have prepared her for the presence of her father, Caleb Hunter. Caleb wasn't just any father. He was a towering figure, standing a solid 6 feet 5 inches, with a voice that could command the attention of an entire courtroom. And that was exactly what he'd done. No sooner had he arrived at the school than the tension in the room shifted. His mere presence filled the space, a calm confidence that everyone could feel. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to win. The moment he walked into the principal's office, Principal David Richards looked up, his face instantly draining of color. Caleb had that effect on people, the kind of power that didn't need to be shouted about, just known. Sophia blinked, her nerves momentarily forgotten as she saw her father sit down with a deliberate calmness. Caleb didn't rush. He didn't need to. He simply slid a thick manila folder onto the principal's desk. Inside that folder was everything Richards needed to understand why the situation was about to escalate into something much bigger. "David," Caleb began, his voice smooth as velvet but carrying the weight of steel beneath it. "Let's cut to the chase. My daughter was expelled unfairly, and now you're going to fix this." Principal Richards hesitated, clearly flustered. "I am not sure what you're asking for." Caleb leaned back in his chair, flashing a small, almost amused smile. "I'm asking for a public apology. I'm asking for my daughter to be reinstated immediately. And I'm asking you to take responsibility for this mess before it gets worse." The room fell silent. There was no need for shouting. Caleb knew that words, when chosen carefully, could have far more impact than any scream. The following morning, Eastbrook High looked the same as always. Students trickling in, the usual clatter of backpacks and chatter filling the air. But there was a palpable tension in the air, like something big was about to go down. And it was. At exactly 8:30 a.m., just as the first bell rang, Caleb Hunter's black SUV pulled into the parking lot. The sleek, glossy vehicle glided to a stop like a car in a movie, turning heads as it parked with the precision of a man who knew exactly how to make an entrance. The students who noticed it were instantly curious. Some just stared, others whispered, and a few muttered under their breath, already starting to guess what was happening. Inside the school, Principal David Richards had just settled into his chair with a steaming mug of coffee, preparing for another mundane day of paperwork and discipline problems. That is, until the secretary's voice crackled over the intercom, making his stomach drop. "Mr. Richards, there's someone here to see you." Richards had no appointment scheduled. Who could this be? He barely had time to finish his sip before the secretary's voice dropped even lower. "It's Caleb Hunter." The name hit him like a punch. Caleb Hunter wasn't just a parent. He was a powerhouse, a local business tycoon with a law firm that handled some of the most high-profile cases in the state. When Caleb entered a room, people didn't just notice. They listened. The principal wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, momentarily frozen in panic. He didn't have time to prepare, but he knew he had to. With a quick breath, he muttered to himself, "This is going to be interesting." Caleb Hunter stepped into the principal's office like he owned the place, and in many ways, he did. The air in the room grew heavier as he moved, his tall, broad frame filling the space. He didn't sit, just stood tall in front of the principal's desk, locking eyes with David Richards, who had already started sweating. Richards, a man in his mid-40s, looked like he had aged 5 years in the last 5 minutes. "Mr. Richards," Caleb began, his voice smooth but tinged with an undercurrent of controlled power. "Let's cut the pleasantries. You know why I'm here. My daughter was expelled yesterday, and that decision was as unjust as it was reckless." He leaned forward slightly, just enough to make Richards feel small in his own office. "And now you're going to make it right." Richards stammered, searching for words but finding none. He cleared his throat and shuffled some papers on his desk, trying to regain some semblance of control. "I assure you, Mr. Hunter, this was a disciplinary decision made based on the school's policies." Caleb's gaze never wavered, his eyes cold and calculating. "That's funny, because it seems to me that a real policy would have required you to at least listen to the facts. But instead, you let an emotionally driven teacher make a decision about my daughter's future, without even a hint of fairness." His voice had become a low, dangerous growl. "And that is where you went wrong." Richard's palms were sweating now, and he could feel the weight of Caleb's words pressing down on him. He knew, deep down, that this was more than just an angry parent. This was a man who didn't play games, a man who could make or break careers with a single call. "You don't have to like it," Caleb continued, his tone still calm, "but by the end of the day, my daughter will be reinstated, and I'll be expecting a formal apology." As Caleb Hunter sat across from Principal Richards, the room seemed to shrink in size. Every word he spoke landed with the weight of a legal brief, as though each syllable was a carefully crafted weapon in a battle he knew he'd win. And it wasn't just about the expulsion. No, this was personal. Ms. Angela West, the history teacher responsible for mess, was still sitting across the room, her face an unreadable mask. Her hands gripped the edge of her chair, her knuckles turning white as Caleb's sharp gaze swept over her. She was caught, There was no escaping the truth anymore. Her record, her pattern, was being laid out for her, and it wasn't pretty. "Ms. West," Caleb said, turning his attention to her, his voice smooth but filled with undeniable authority. "You've been targeting my daughter. You've been unfairly grading her work, silencing her when she dared to speak the truth, and now you've escalated things to an unlawful expulsion. Do you honestly think I won't notice? Do you think this was just going to slip under the radar?" Angela's face flushed. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She wasn't used to being confronted like this. In fact, she'd never been in a position where the tables were turned on her. Caleb slid a stack of papers onto the desk with a swift motion, like a lawyer about to present the knockout punch. "These are statements from several students and parents. They've seen what you've done. And now, the whole school is going to know." Richard shifted uncomfortably, his face growing paler with every passing second. Caleb wasn't just here for an apology. He was here to make sure that this never happened to anyone again. And when Caleb spoke, people listened, because he had the facts, the power, and the unyielding will make sure his daughter was never silenced again. As Caleb leaned back in his chair, his eyes never left Principal Richards. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. It was clear now. Caleb wasn't here to ask for anything. He was here to make things right. "I don't know if you understand what's at stake here, David," Caleb continued, his voice as smooth as ever but laced with an unmistakable edge. "This isn't just about my daughter. This is about what's right, what's fair. You've allowed a teacher to take advantage of her position, pushing students aside just because they dared to speak the truth. This is bigger than one suspension. It's about every student who's ever been silenced." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously on his desk. It was clear he hadn't expected this kind of confrontation. He wasn't used to dealing with this level of intensity, at least not from a parent. "David," Caleb pressed, "I don't think you're getting it. Your decision yesterday wasn't just a mistake. It was a violation, and you're going to fix it now, or the consequences will go far beyond just you and me." Richard swallowed hard, his throat tight. He'd seen Caleb's firm hand in action before. He'd heard the whispers of his reputation. And now, standing in the eye of the storm, he knew Caleb wasn't bluffing. With a reluctant sigh, Richards finally spoke. "What exactly do you want from me, Caleb?" Caleb smiled, almost predatory in his calm. "A formal apology, a public reinstatement of my daughter, and a full report to the school board about what's been going on. If that's not too much to ask." It was a demand, not a request. And as Caleb's words hung in the air, Richards realized he had no choice but to comply. The day after Caleb's meeting, Sophia Hunter walked into the school with a new sense of confidence. She wasn't the same girl who had been dragged into the principal's office the day before. She had changed overnight, fueled by the power of knowing she had the truth on her side. The weight that had been crushing her chest now felt lighter. And it wasn't just her. The entire school seemed to sense a shift in the air. The first thing Sophia noticed when she walked through the school's front doors was the change in the staff's demeanor. Teachers who once ignored her or shot her dismissive glances now seemed more cautious. Some even avoided eye contact altogether. But she wasn't just here for them. No, Sophia had more important things to focus on. Principal David Richards stood in the hallway, talking to a few teachers. But as soon as he saw her, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. His face went pale, and he quickly excused himself from the conversation, mumbling something about a meeting. Sophia couldn't help but smile to herself. The weight of Caleb's words had reached him, but the real victory hadn't come yet. That would come when she heard those words from Ms. Angela West herself. By the time lunch rolled around, the whole school was buzzing. David Richards stood in front of the student body, his voice crackling slightly through the PA system. "Good afternoon, students. I have an important announcement to make. After reviewing the situation, we have decided to reverse the expulsion of Sophia Hunter. She will be returning to class starting tomorrow. I also want to acknowledge that mistakes were made, and we will be taking steps to ensure that all students are treated fairly moving forward." The crowd didn't erupt in applause. It wasn't that kind of victory. But as Sophia stood there with her head held high, she knew this wasn't just a win for her. This was a win for every student who had ever been silenced. As Sophia walked through the crowded halls of Eastbrook High, she felt the weight of the moment. The victory was still fresh, and as much as she tried to soak it in, there was something deeper growing inside her. She had fought for her voice, and it wasn't just about winning this battle. It was about the realization that the fight for fairness, for equality, would always be ongoing. But today, she had made her mark. It wasn't just her. In the days that followed, Sophia became a symbol, a quiet hero to those who had silently endured what she had, and a reminder to the students who had been too afraid to speak up for fear of being punished. Every day, more and more students came to her, sharing their own stories of mistreatment. The whispers of unfair grades, the silencing of opinions, the subtle discrimination that had been allowed to slide for too long. Rachel, one of the few other black students in her grade, approached her one day after class. "What you did, that was amazing," Rachel said, her voice tinged with both admiration and relief. "I never said anything before. I thought it was just me. But you showed me it's okay to speak out." Sophia smiled at Rachel, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. "It's not just about speaking out, Rachel. It's about making sure others know they can, too." The lesson wasn't lost on her. One voice could shake things up, and sometimes one voice was enough to change the world, or at least the world of one school. Sophia had gone from being the quiet, overlooked student to the one who changed the game. But more than that, she had shown her peers the power of speaking up, and how much strength could come from demanding fairness, no matter the consequences. Sophia sat on the back porch of her family's house in Sunnybrook, California, looking out at the sky as the sun set. The past few days felt like a whirlwind, the reinstatement, the apology, the public acknowledgement, but now, in the quiet, she had time to think. What had she really accomplished? The victory over Ms. Angela West was huge, sure, but it was also just one step in a much larger journey. The fight didn't stop there. It couldn't. She knew that now. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Rachel, one of the students who had quietly confided in her after the whole ordeal. "Hey, a few of us are thinking about starting a group at school. A space to talk about things, speak out, and make sure we're heard. You in?" Sophia stared at the message for a few moments, feeling the weight of what was being asked. A group, a place for people like her. People who didn't feel like they had a voice, people who had been silenced for too long. It wasn't just about her anymore. Her father's words echoed in her mind. The world needs people who don't back down. Sophia smiled to herself as she typed a response. "Count me in." The lesson was clear. When you speak up, you take the first step, but that step can inspire others to do the same. The moment you stop backing down is the moment you stop letting anyone control your story. And it was more than just a personal victory for Sophia. It was the beginning of something bigger, a spark that could light a fire change. Sophia wasn't just speaking up for herself anymore. She was speaking up for everyone who had ever felt invisible, for everyone who thought they didn't have the power to make a difference. She had learned the most important lesson of all. No one can silence you unless you let them.